right, well, I think for the sake of time, I think we will go ahead and get started. Barry Jameson, who is going to be doing the trust presentation, is on his way. He was coming from Columbus, so he didn't anticipate getting here from about 10 after 1 or so. But I just wanted to quickly, I'm Dan Otke, I'm the superintendent at Claremont County Board of DD. Usually, our common practice is to use the months of July and November to kind of touch base, do some maybe special presentations, or just updates, because our board doesn't meet in those 2 months. So our board meets 10 months out of the year, and so in both July and November, they take a little break, and so it affords me the opportunity to kind of get out and do some of these kinds of things. So it is great to see such a good turnout. It's a beautiful day for it, so we're appreciative of you guys coming out. And so I'm just going to kind of roll through some slides and talk a little bit about some things we're looking at for 2018. If there are things that are questions, sometimes one of those things that I can kind of get into is, you know, we do this kind of every day, so some of the terminology, if it's something that just is like, what is that? This is very informal, so raise your hand, and I'll try and answer that for you as best I can. So it might be helpful to kind of get a sense, just a little bit in terms of maybe from you all, kind of, do you mostly have adult children, younger children, kind of what's the lay of the land there in terms of folks there, people that you're related to, so.
Adult children.
Okay. Okay.
Adult.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Sense of theme there, so that's good. So, again, hopefully you'll find a little bit of what I'm sharing a little bit in terms of helpful for future purposes here. So this is all kind of stuff that is in draft, but these are things that as a board and as an agency we try to keep an eye on. Things kind of, as we kind of put it, things on the radar. None of these probably will come as a complete shock to you in terms of some of the things you probably not only hear about, but also maybe personally experience. We always try to keep an eye on our waiting list and unmet needs. So, you know, we have various waiting lists at the agency in relation to services. What we try to do is minimize those to the best of our ability. And so we're always keeping an eye on that and kind of seeing where we need to tackle things next. Transition age youth. So doesn't quite sound like a hit. It sounds like a lot of folks, you guys are kind of past this point, but this is an area we're keeping a pretty close eye on. And when I talk about transition age youth, I'm talking about kids that are transitioning from school into the adult realm kind of thing. So it used to be, you know, you go back maybe 10, 15 years ago, typically for kids that were coming out, that had developmental disability, that kind of came out of school, the traditional path was we had what we would, for lack of better terminology, they were called workshops or, you know, adult day program type of programs. There's a real transition going on with those types of services, and we're right there with it in terms of really trying to, and you'll hear a lot about things like employment first, really emphasizing employment for folks with developmental disabilities. And when we talk about the settings of like your traditional day program workshops, those are kind of the settings where, you know, they're there for folks, but it's not maybe the first stop kind of thing. And so we're looking at this quite a bit because we're trying to really encourage for those kids that are coming up what we can do to help them find employment. And we have a lot of different programs. We have what has been previously called Bridges to Transition. It's a youth employment program. Now it's more of a pre-employment program that we work with folks to seek that out. So we're keeping an eye on that as well. Youth and adults with intensive needs. This is certainly a situation in which we've seen, especially I would say, and I can look to the guys over here. It gets a little bit, by the way, these are some of our staff over here, so you've probably met a couple of them before. So from our community services department. We have really seen quite an increase in terms of intensive needs in relation to a lot of our teen population. So we're really kind of seeing a real growth in that area in terms of some intensive needs and some of the services that they might need. But that also comes into play for adults as well. and what that means. So we're keeping an eye on things on the radar there. Obviously, aging caregivers, with the baby boomer generation getting to a place where they're reaching retirement. You know, we have just a lot of, and this may touch you guys in terms of, in relation to, you've been, you know, a lot of our parents are caring for their loved ones at home. What does that mean for the long term? What does that mean for the long-term planning of our agency in relation to, because ultimately DD is the responsible party. If there is no, in an emergency, you know, in a situation where a family member is not able to care for their loved one, we're jumping in. And so we have to keep a close eye on that in relation to what does that look like for the future, and obviously that's something we keep on the radar. This is kind of a, so this one, when I put this out here, so this is conflict-free case management. What does that mean? So I'll try and keep this pretty quick, but essentially, for years we've been able, so there's something called, so we try to leverage a lot of resources through what we can do through Medicaid. Okay, so oftentimes what we can do is there are things called Medicaid waivers or Medicaid services in which we're able to use some local dollars to leverage Medicaid dollars to be able to do more. So if we put in $1 of local, we might be able to get 3 in terms of Medicaid to be able to provide more services to people. So the federal government, back all the way now in 2014, made a decision that in terms of conflict-free case management, we have SSAs who write plans and help individuals kind of look to the future and determine what services they're going to need. And we've also provided, so we've been a provider of service for Medicaid, meaning we actually provide the direct service, maybe it's the day service, that kind of thing, at the board of DD. Those two can't meet anymore. So what we've been working towards is trying to make sure that it's a situation that we're still going to be the writer of the plans, but we can't ultimately, at some point, we can't be the deliverer of the service under the Medicaid waiver. And we've done a lot of work on that front already, but we got a couple more areas that we got to work on there to address. So, and then community inclusion. This is, I mean, something that obviously we're always working on. This is in relation to helping individuals receive service in the least restrictive environment possible, and ultimately, it's even more than that. That they are a part of their communities to the degree that they want to be, and to the degree that we can help them to be. So this is something that we're working with not only families and individuals, but also our providers with as well. I'll roll through some of these pretty quickly. This is kind of a new thing that's out there, supported decision making. It's really, and our folks are going to be getting some more training on this, but to really help individuals, I guess, really kind of help them make decisions for themselves and finding ways to get that, put those processes in place. I kind of like to refer to, we all kind of need a little bit of help sometimes. I mean, to be transparent, I'm not great with cars, so, I don't know much about, if my car needs a repair, I got a couple people at work that I go to and say, hey, it's doing this, and so it helps me to make some supportive decision making around what am I going to do to get that fixed, kind of thing. Versus, and the same thing applies for all of us. We all rely on others sometimes for help. That's for the people that we serve as well, and so we're trying to work through different ways so we can put some processes in place to help them. So maybe we can look to ways where, because as our hope is that fewer people might need guardians, that they can be more part of their own independent decision making. They might just need some help with that. Sometimes rather than having to go full-fledged to the level of guardianship, and sometimes that's a necessity, but sometimes it's a situation where individuals, they just need a little bit of help, and how can we kind of encourage that and work on that a little bit. This is a big one for us. We've dabbled in this for the better part of a couple years, but one of the things we recognize, mental health supports. So a lot of individuals that we serve, while they have an intellectual or developmental disability, they also might have some mental health support needs. And what we've seen over the years is we have a lot of mental health supports in our community, but are they equipped and able to really help the people that we serve, as adequately as we would hope? So we've developed a program that serves adults. It's still rather small. but we're investing in this area a little bit because we think there is some real value in it, and we think it could help. And not only that, we think it also can help for family members as well, thinking about different ways we might be able to expand that down the line kind of thing. Provider needs, we partner with a ton of different providers in our community. One of the things I can tell you right now is there's a struggle in terms of recruiting. So the good news is that unemployment is very low. The bad news is for our providers, it's very hard for them to find good people to work. So what we're doing is partnering with our providers to be able to maybe help them in that area a little bit because we need them just as much as individuals and families, because if we can write plans all day and we can put services in place, but if there's no one there to deliver it, then that's an issue. So we're trying to help them with that as well. And then just around some training needs, there's always different interesting things that are coming down the pike in relation to some things that providers are working with individuals, especially around employment. There are some new services around employment that we think providers can help us with, and we're going to be working on that front a little bit too. Transportation is always out there. I mean, that just is kind of an issue we're constantly trying to look at. And then these last three are just things kind of our agency will be going through in 2018. So the Department of Developmental Disabilities, there's a State Department of Developmental Disabilities, okay? And we don't necessarily answer to them, but we work in partnership with them. But there is an accreditation process that they do once every 3 years. We're going to be going through that accreditation process coming up in February. The local versus waiver funding, so what we try to do, we have a lot of programs that when we talk about locally funding, we do that with the local tax levy money that we're very pleased and happy and appreciative of the taxpayers that afford us the opportunity to do that. But what we're trying to do is figure out ways that we might be able to leverage, ways that we can maybe help leverage that with some Medicaid dollars, that we can free up more dollars to do more. And so there's a couple programs we're looking at for next year where maybe we can do some of that in a little bit more expansive way. And finally, next year, while it's not official, we have a 5-year operating levy that is set to expire at the end of 2018. So obviously we need to get that renewed. So we're going to be working with the commissioners and talking with them about that as far as looking to get that on the ballot for next year. So, and I can share with you why that's so important, which is my next slide. This is our forecast, and I don't know, that might be a little hard to see, but the blue, which is on the left, is our revenue. And right now everything is looking really good, and that's because we had 2 replacement levies that were passed, a replacement levy that passed last year in 2016. But without that renewal levy coming up next year in 2018, this looks very different. So this picture changes dramatically. That revenue goes down to about $15 million, and obviously when you do the math, that can really have an impact. So things are really, really positive in the sense of what we're able to do right now here in Clermont County for the people that we serve, the families that we serve. We're able to responsibly address some waiting lists and kind of work on some things there. So, but without that, we've got to make sure that we keep that. Without that passing, and next year that could be a challenge. So. I'm just going to roll through some of these because I want to get to Barry as soon as possible. This is for our early intervention program. Yeah, sorry. A few things we're kind of looking at for next year. Early intervention is birth to 3, so it's our early intervention program that actually is able to, what we always hope to do through that program is to be able to get to kids and families early so that we can hopefully maybe help them so they may not need services for the long term. A couple things. Another kind of interesting tidbit with early intervention, when we talk about some mental health services, we actually we're seeing kids at such an early age experiencing such trauma because of what they're experiencing. So, for example, you've all heard about the opiate issue that is out there. We are seeing instances in which kids at a very, very young age are being impacted from a trauma perspective because of what the things they're experiencing. So what we're trying to do is kind of shift if we can get to kids and their families really, really early, to help them with some of those kinds of things. We're hoping that might avoid us having to maybe face some issues when they're 10, 11, 12, into their teens kind of thing. So we're kind of exploring that a little bit. And then some of these are just to get annual community awareness out there, which is always something that's important. And some pre and post, they've got some evaluation types of tools they're looking at, and there's some equipment that we're looking at for next year for the early intervention program. I talked a little bit about this, so I'm going to pretty much gloss through, get through this slide, but in terms of our mental health service program, we're going to be trying to figure out in terms of what our service capacity is, areas for growth, and then coordinating and collaborating across systems. And the big thing is what we're trying to do is track what that might look like in terms of outcomes. So, you know, if we're able to get to adults, kids, that kind of thing, and try and work on that a little bit, what are the outcomes from that, to be able to see if it's working. So this is where the guys are in the, by the wall over there come into play here a little bit. So we are, you know, obviously our waiver waiting lists, and we have a program called Individual Budget that is kind of a program that we put in place for adults to be able to be creative about ways they would like to explore things in their community. We are talking about addressing those waiting lists in ways that we can tackle it in terms of 10 new self-waivers, 10 individual budgets off the waiting list. And then we continue to look at, again, I've already talked about kind of this ways that we can hope to refinance to be able to do more for some people in the community there. So. We contract for a lot of different services, different things that we kind of work with different agencies. We're looking to continue those for next year. And we also have a program which maybe some of you have been involved with. It's called our Alternative Options Program. So essentially it is something that it offers and affords individuals and families an opportunity, for example, if they don't have the funds maybe to go to camp and they'd like to do that in the summer, this program allows them to be able to do that. Or if there's a particular specific equipment need, again, that's something that you can tap into to help with that. Or if it's a respite thing, or just, you know, kind of fill in the blank. We try to keep it, we have parameters around it, but we try to also kind of work with families to be able to hopefully use those funds in ways that are helpful to them, so that they can get some things that might help them to either get a break or do some of the things that might be helpful to them. And you name it, it kind of runs the gamut there. So we're looking to continue that program for next year as well. And I think most of these I've already touched on. Looking at transportation, provider specialized training and expansion of employment services. Again, our intensive needs for youth. And also our self-advocacy development. So we're working with some folks to expand, you know, kind of what we're doing in terms of helping individuals to learn more about self-advocacy, self-determination. So we're getting some training in place for early next year to be able to help expand that out a little bit. We do offer an opportunity for public input, and that will be on December 14th from 4 to 5 at our Wildey Center. So this is public input on the goals and the things that are in place that we're looking to do next year. So if there are things that you're particularly interested in that we make sure we don't lose sight of, this is the opportunity to be able to offer that. And also, if you can't make it to that, Lisa Davis, her information is up here, so you can call Lisa, you can email her with any things that you would like to see put into our annual action plan for next year, so that we don't lose sight of those kinds of things and make sure we address them. So what question, I kind of ran through a lot of that stuff pretty quickly, but what questions, are there any questions that you have of me? Yes?
I just wondered, you were talking about your waiting list. How many people do you have on your waiting list in this town?
Yeah, well, in terms of, if you're talking about the waiver, so we have a waiver waiting list.
Yes, we're on the
Yeah, so, and that's roughly about, I guess it's about 875. One of the things you're gonna, and this is really getting into the weeds, so I don't want to get, but one of the things that is kind of coming down the pike is maybe the state's kind of looking at the waiting list as a whole, and kind of trying to figure out what's the best route to go, because there really is this kind of, what are folks' needs? So, kind of what do you need right now versus what might you need down the road kind of thing. And so the waiver waiting list is a little bit to see, because it's one of those things where there's a lot of people on it, but we're really trying to figure out what is the current need. Like if you might have,
Well, I mean, don't want to interrupt, but
Yeah.
actually, we did a survey for the state on the waiting list. And one of the questions was, do you currently need, or your loved one needs services right now? And the answer was 50% of people said no, they don't need anything right
Or they're like, or something that may be on 3 list that's not
now. You
relevant.
do it for the future, right? So I think that's a little bit kind of to your point.
Yeah, I think, and so there's going to be some work on that coming down the pike pretty quickly, I think, in 2018 as to what that's going to look like. And I don't have enough information right now to say exactly what that, but it's a kind of stay tuned thing. And I promise you, once we have more meaningful information, we'll get the word out and find ways to maybe make that happen. But I think the key is, what I can't emphasize enough, especially when I'm talking with families or individuals, please keep in contact with us. So if there's something going on that, and maybe if you have an SSA, or maybe if you don't, call us anyway. We'll find someone to get to talk with you. But it's really, really important, if you've got something happening that you need some help with, or you just have a question about, or you're anticipating that it's coming, please let us know, because that's something that really helps us then to try and figure out, as best we can to try and, but again, keep it, we want to stay in touch on it to figure out ways that we can try to plan to see what that's going to look like for, especially, because it'd be interesting to know what those folks that we're talking, those individuals, what they, kind of what needs they have. Is it 24/7? Is it, a different, what that, because we might be able to put some things in place that can be very supportive for an individual. One of the real interesting things that I think we've only dabbled in, and I think statewide have only dabbled in, are some of the, what are considered remote monitoring. So there are systems in place where you can actually, if a person's living independently, but they just might need a reminder for their medication, that kind of thing. There actually can be a remote, so someone who is not physically present, but be able to maybe give those folks a reminder, hey, it's time to take your medicine, that kind of thing. And it's just kind of, it's still in its infancy, but I think it has some interesting possibilities. But it's one of those things that there's still work to be done there. So.
But it's a good idea, I think.
Yes.
I think it's a really good idea. Because the challenge, and I'll finish up, the challenge with this is, when we talk about a workforce shortage, that is a reality. So to be able to have a person at every one of these places may not be feasible, but if you have a remote, some kind of system in which that person, someone that's sitting, it kind of feels Big Brother-ish kind of thing, but just having out there that can, do that, be able to chime in, and they're sitting, and they're doing that for 10 or 12 different people, that helps us, figure that out. So. All right, I think my time is up. Do you guys, if there are any more questions, I'm still going to be here, so please come find me afterwards. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to turn it over now to Mr. Jameson.
All right. Okay. All right. Good to be here. So I'm Barry Jameson. I'm a certified financial planner. So most of the time when people think about a financial planner, you think about finances, managing your finances, and that's certainly a part of what we do. But I'm a certified financial planner, and we look at folks' comprehensive financial picture, and a big part of that is estate planning. So having your wills, having things like trusts in place before you die is a big part of your kind of current peace of mind. And listening to this whole discussion about waiting lists and waivers just kind of brings me back into the policy world. So a big part of my former career was working in long-term care policy and DD policy, so I'm very familiar with issues like waiting lists. In fact, I just cut in there talking about how I actually worked with the state, developed the waiting list survey. I don't know, I know they recently redid that. I don't know if any of you have ever taken a waiting list survey, but found out some very interesting information from that. And one of them was, you know, half the people who are on the waiting list currently are not waiting for services, or waiting for services in the future, of course, but not currently. So, so I love that whole world of policy, but I really wanted to get involved more helping concretely families like yourself, and so that's why 3 years ago switched into the whole world of financial planning. And so I don't know how many were here. About 1.5 years ago, I gave a talk on ABLE accounts. Was anybody at that? Okay. And even if you weren't at that talk, how many of you have been to a presentation on ABLE accounts? Okay, so a few more. So I'm going to say about a third or half of you have heard something on ABLE accounts. And that was just a really cool time for me. I went across, I would say, 15 to 20 county boards, like audience like yourself, and just kind of explain how cool ABLE accounts are in terms of helping individuals with their finances, in terms of being able to save, in terms of being able to qualify for services. But my message back then is similar to the message I'm going to have on special needs trust, is that setting up an ABLE account, which I always say, and by the way, I use the term ABLE and stable synonymously. Stable's kind of like the Ohio brand of an ABLE account. But the message then, and the same for special needs trust, is this is just the start of your planning. It's not the end. Okay, it's something I think very worthwhile for a lot of families to set up. And so the other message in talking about special needs trust is, I think a lot of people get intimidated when they think about trust, and they think of it's mainly just for really wealthy people. Okay, and I'm here to say that that is just not the case. I mean, if you have assets that you care about, and not just wanting to give all those assets to the state, then you're going to want to consider very strongly a special needs trust. So it's not just for wealthy people, okay? So that would be, you know, my other message coming out of this talk is, you know, this is just the start of your estate plan. If you haven't started on this road, this could be one way to get started. The other is it's accessible. So it's something that isn't just for wealthy families. It's something that is really not cost prohibitive in terms of getting a lawyer to draft that trust document. There is an expenditure involved, and I'll kind of go through some of the cost of that, but it's accessible. And so I just want you to consider, I mean, if you could take, well, the last thing I want you to consider or get from this talk is that there probably is going to be some trust set up for your loved one, for your individual with disability. It's either going to be because you set it up or because the probate court set it up. And if the probate court sets it up, that means they're involved in all the decision making. So if Johnny needs or wants to go on a trip, well, that probably, you know, is something that would meet his needs. That probably would work okay, but guess what? Maybe now the judge has a say in that and maybe thinks that's a frivolous expenditure. I mean, do you really want the probate judge to be involved in your family matters? Okay, and I'm not here to try this is not a talk on selling trust, okay? I'm into let's get a plan together. And hearing some of the questions about waiting lists, and you just think 830 waivers. I mean, it just seems kind of like hard to plan, right? I mean, it's just hard to plan. But this is something in your control, that you can set up certain financial things in place so that at least you know that your assets, where they're going and how your assets are going to be distributed upon your death. So that's something that you can control. And when I think there's a certain peace of mind that comes with doing that. And so that's part of my mission in doing this talk, and it's part of my mission in terms of being a financial planner. I love to help people plan because I just think it's vital for your own peace of mind. So I gotta say, as a commercial, I'll help you manage your money, but really I'm more into people having a solid plan in place, which may include in your situation setting up a special needs trust. So that's kind of the goals for the presentation. I've done this talk now 2 other times. It's worked the best when people have questions throughout, because we're going to get into some weeds, and I would much prefer if you kind of understood terms, understood a point I'm trying to make during than waiting later. Okay? Sound fair? All right. So we'll talk about what are special needs trusts, and then some considerations in terms of what you have to think about in managing that trust and setting it up. There's costs are an issue. And then we'll talk a lot about stable accounts and special needs trust. Now this isn't like you have to make a choice here, that somehow you either decide, hey, I'm going to set up a stable account or I'm going to set up a special needs trust. They're, in my mind, very complementary, and since it's very simple to set up an ABLE account and not very costly, in my mind there's really no good reason why you shouldn't set up an ABLE account. I mean, there actually are a few, but it's like you can set it up with as little as $50 to start, and it's like I think $2 cost per month to maintain. So this is just not a lot of money here, and there's a lot of convenience behind it. But it's not as if you're having to make a choice. I'm going to talk about strategies about how the two can work together. The other question I forgot to ask everybody though, how many of you have just set up a stable account in the room? Okay, so we got 2 families for sure. And was that easy to set up? Fairly easy to set up? You have a comment?
It was kind of a mixed bag. It was very easy to get on the computer and fill out the form.
Okay.
Then they come back and they want some additional information, and that was fairly easy, like you want a birth certificate and social security card, not emailed, but like a physical copy thing to send. You can handle that. And then they start wanting the guys, your individual's phone bill or bank account number.
This doesn't sound like an ABLE account. This sounds like...
Yeah, it was. And and we're like, well, that's why we're setting it up, because he didn't have a bank account. He doesn't live in his own house, so he doesn't have a utility bill or phone bill. So they're saying, well, where he lives, if it's like a residential setting, in this case SODC, have them send us a letter certifying this is where he lives and his address, and we'll be good with that, which they were ultimately, but that was a funny little wrinkle I wasn't anticipating.
Okay, so a little bit, okay, I have not heard that, so that's interesting. there is, you do have to set things up electronically. So you're making transfers from either your account or is it your son's account to go back and forth between the stable account and some bank account. So all the transfers are electronic. So there's a little setup with that.
They're cool with you sending a check.
I had not heard that. Okay, I think the preference is to make those transfers electronically. So I had not heard that you could send a paper check, but I think they prefer anyways electronic transfers. So I was just curious about that, but for everybody else here, I think it's very doable to set up, and like I said, not very costly. So I was just curious to see where people are at with that. So we'll talk about how they work together, and then finally, a little bit of a word on pooled trust. And this is, pooled trusts are a way for people to kind of get involved in setting up a special needs trust very cheaply. So I wanted to throw that out as an option. If you're intimidated by some of the cost figures I throw out there, or working with an estate planning attorney that you may not be familiar with, this is a way to even lower the hurdle much more, and you're working with an organization that deals with hundreds of trusts, and they pool all the money together, but you maintain your slice of it. And it's just again a very kind of lower cost way to get involved with trust. So if you come out of here, it's just like, hey, I have every reason I could set this up if I want to. You know, you may decide it's not worth my time, or it's not going to be a part of my plan. But don't go away because of the cost issue, because I think, you know, the cost, especially in working with a pool trust, is very reasonable. All right, so that's what we're going to talk about. So to start off, I want to just kind of get very basic here, and let's talk about what a trust is. It's a legal agreement that's used in estate planning to determine how a person's assets, like yourself, how they're going to be distributed, either during your lifetime, but mostly, I'm familiar with, after your death, okay? So most of the time, families are concerned, well, what's going to happen to my house, okay, or what's going to happen to my 401k or my IRA upon my death. And so, you know, you can address, one of the ways you can address that, there's many ways you can, but is through designating those assets to go to the trust upon your death. So when we talk about trusts, there's typically you have a grantor. A grantor is a person who sets up the trust. So let's say it's the parent, since we're talking about special needs trust, it's the parent of the individual, starts it, okay? Now, I'll say this probably more than a couple times during the presentation, you don't have to have dollars on hand to set up a trust. So initially, what I'm familiar with is families set up, they make an arrangement with a lawyer to draft a trust document that basically is like a container that will hold money after the death of both parents. Okay, so initially though, there's no money in that trust. So you don't have to have assets that you want designated immediately to go in the trust. You can, if you want to, but there's certain reasons that you may not want that to happen, because whenever you're talking about trust, you have to think about the cost of maintaining the trust, and part of that is taxes, possible tax consequences of having trust with income, or trust that that has income or assets in it, okay? So we have a grantor, we have a trustee, that's the person who's managing the trust. Let's say in my example here, parents die, there's a trustee, could be a sibling of the individual, could be a relative, it could be a neighbor who just knows the individual well, someone that you trust, okay, to manage the financial affairs now of the individual, because these assets are being passed over now to the individual in the trust. The beneficiary is the individual, okay, the recipient of what the trust assets. So any questions about those terms, what a trust is? So there's a difference, there's a slight difference when we talk, I mean, trusts are, I have many clients that we work with have trusts set up for family members. They might set up a trust, let's say, because they have young adult grown children that they're concerned that if they pass over $300,000 or $500,000 of their assets, if they happen to die for unexpectedly, that's like too much money for their adult children in their mind to have all at once. They may be great kids, but all of a sudden you have all this money. There might be a friend out there who's waiting to prey on that adult child. So a trust in that situation says, hey, Joey is entitled to get the money if he needs any withdrawal for college education, for health issues, and he can even withdraw up to $50,000 a year, but he's not entitled to the whole money until he's like age 40. So are you familiar with that whole? So I just mentioned that because that's like the trust I'm familiar with a lot, but we're going to be talking specifically about special needs trust. It's a category of trust. It has some special features to it, so that's why it's special. Okay, the main special feature to it that distinguishes it from an ordinary trust, if you will, is that assets that are in the special needs trust are protected from being counted as a countable resource when the state looks at qualifying the individual for Medicaid or for your waivers. And Social Security also looks at it differently when you're talking about assets in the trust. So that is just like a very cool thing, if you will, about special needs trust. It's also what's in common with ABLE accounts. ABLE or stable accounts do the same thing. They shelter assets. So they're not being counted as a resource. I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty tough to qualify for Medicaid if you have a $1,500, excuse me, it's $2,000 asset limit. It's easy, let's say an individual has a job, it's easy for them to get over that asset limit. And that's why before ABLE accounts, because you could just use ABLE accounts as like a saving account for the individual. Before that day is like there's this whole game you had to play in terms of, well, we have to get Johnny a TV and we have to make sure that we spend his money to get under that asset limit. It was like a problem. Maybe it's not a problem for you guys, but when you hear about situations like that, it's just like that's just ridiculous. So the special needs trust, ABLE accounts, they take care of that because assets are sheltered. They're set up for individuals who lack a mental capability of managing their own financial affairs. So that's a characteristic of the special needs trust. You have to have an individual who's not capable of managing their financial affairs, and that would be a criteria in having that designation of a special needs trust. And, yeah, I mean, implicit in all this is that the special needs trust is set up for an individual with special needs. So, any questions on a special needs trust and its distinction between that and just an ordinary trust? Yes?
So how is that lack of mental capacity to manage the finances demonstrated? So it's a criterion, do you have to go through some process?
Well, I think it really is just, does that person have a guardian? Okay, or a trustee, but I don't know if there's an exact criteria set up.
You don't have to be the guardian in order to set one up?
The individual can't set up a special needs trust. They can't go to a lawyer themselves and get one set up. So I guess that would be a threshold consideration right there. If they can do that, no, it wouldn't, they couldn't be designated as a special needs trust at that point. They could set up their own ABLE account, and that's a possibility because they own the assets, if you will, in the ABLE or stable account. But they don't own the assets in a special needs trust. That's the purview of the trust. And it's really the trust document that governs how the assets are managed. It's managed for the benefit of the individual, but they're not controlling it. Okay? Any other questions? All right. So there's two types of special needs trust that you have to be aware of. One is a first party special needs trust, and those are assets that are funded by the individual. So where does the individual get funds? Okay, that's a common question. They could be a recipient of or beneficiary of a lawsuit. Somehow they're entitled to some settlement. So that settlement then would go, or the proceeds of that settlement would go into a first party trust. Or the other thing that could happen is when the individual is qualifying for Social Security, Social Security determines, oh, we actually owe you money from the past 20 years. You qualified 20 years prior, and so there you have this lump sum of $100,000, and it can happen. I've been around those situations. So that money then could be put into a first party trust as well. Now, there's another type of special needs trust, and that's a third party or family trust, I'll call it, okay? And those trusts are funded by a third party, not anybody except the individual. So it could be, it's primarily the family that's going to be populating or funding these trusts. And so the big distinguishing, so besides who's funding the trust, the big difference between these two types of trust is that in the first party trust, they're both, okay, since it's a special needs trust, the assets in it are sheltered. But in a first party trust situation, the state is going to look at that trust and say, okay, what are the assets in the account? They become a creditor on the special needs trust. And so they're going to say, this is how much money Medicaid has paid for that individual's services since the time the trust was set up. And they are then, they're going to claim any money that's owed based upon services that were given to the individual. So in most cases, or a lot of cases, any assets that are remaining in the first party trust will go all back to the state, okay? That's very similar to an ABLE account. able account or stable account, same thing. And that was, when I presented that feature of the stable accounts, I was saying how cool it was. People were like, "Oh, that stinks," and that does stink. If you have other, you would want other things to happen with those assets. There's other family members that you care about. So that's the difference with a third-party trust is assets, they're not only protected in terms of qualifying the individual for services currently in terms of the assets in the trust, but they don't get clawed back to the state upon the death of the individual. So the remaining beneficiaries designated in the trust, they can become recipients of the trust assets. So that's distinguishing. Now remember, it kind of makes sense because the money is being populated from outside the individual, from the family. So the other key thing to think about in a third-party trust, and another name for it, is a wholly, not wholly as in blessed, but wholly, WHOLLY, wholly discretionary trust. The power of, managing the assets behind that trust rests in the trustee. So, in the trust document. So the trustee is the one controlling the assets, and they have total power, okay, over how the trust operates. And so from that standpoint, the state's saying that can't be assets counted against the individual because he has no discretion. He has no power to manage money in that. Okay? So does everybody understand the difference between a first party and a third party trust? Okay. So, I made this statement in the beginning. It's like, at the end of the day, you don't have to decide right now or down the road whether to set up a trust or not. There will be a trust set up for the individual whether you do it or not. It's just going to be, are you going to set up a family trust and all the assets don't go to the state upon the death of the individual? Or is it going to be a situation where you didn't decide and the situation happens where, let's say you designated your house to the individual, you want them to have a place to live. That's actually not a good example. Let's say you designated your individual savings, you had $100,000 to give to the individual, and that's going to disqualify that individual immediately for Medicaid services. So the SSA here is going to have to work with a lawyer to get a trust set up. So now it's the individual's assets, okay? It has been designated by will, let's say, to go to the individual. But now, in order to qualify for Medicaid, there has to be a trust set up, okay? So it's going to be a first-party trust, and the probate judge has to approve that trust. And a lot of times, a probate judge wants to be involved as a kind of a co-trustee on that trust arrangement. And so there's a situation. And at the end of the day, any monies that are remaining in the trust will go back to the state in the first party. So you can decide ahead of time to set up a family trust where it's protected and the remaining beneficiaries can claim those assets, or don't do anything and it's going to be probably a first party trust upon your death. I mean, I know it's kind of stark, but it's probably what would happen. Yes?
If you have two sons with disabilities,
Okay.
and you do the first party trust, as the first party trust, say one son has so much money and the other has so much money.
Okay.
If the money, say the one son dies, would his money go back to the state and not go to his
Yes.
brother?
Yes, we'll go back to the state. So in that situation, you'd want to try to figure out how to put that in a family trust.
So
So
you have a trust.
What's that?
We do have a trust.
Okay, so it's making that trust a third-party trust. I mean, the funds, did they initially come from you, or if they came from you, you could set up as a family trust. Okay, otherwise,
And not do a special needs trust?
well, no, but when I say family trust, these are two types of special needs trust. One is a first-party special needs trust, and another is a third-party, wholly discretionary family trust. They're both special needs trust.
Okay.
Okay, they're just two types. And the distinguishing feature is who's funding it. Okay, if it's funded by the individual, if it's his assets, and it can be their assets, not just from a settlement, but upon death, if you designated the individual's name, which I strongly discourage, not to do that, but if you do that, then that's that person's money, and in order to qualify for Medicaid services at that point, they would have to set up a first-party special needs trust. That was the point I was making. But good question. Any other questions regarding first or third-party trust? Okay. Let's say a couple other things about each of those. And so the first-party trust is created by the parent, grandparent, trust beneficiary, or the guardian. Okay, so those are the folks who can create the special needs trust. The beneficiary has to be under age 65 when the trust is created. And I've already mentioned assets within that first party trust don't count against Medicaid. They also don't count against Social Security, SSI. So that's really important as well. And so you want to be mindful in making distributions from a special needs trust. And this is a difference when you're talking about a first-party special needs trust, which is in some ways very similar to an ABLE account, but it's different because with an ABLE account, you don't have to worry about distributions as much. On a first-party special needs trust, if you have a distribution for, let's say, room and board, for, let's say, rent for the group home, that they look at as maintenance of the individual, that somehow he should be paying for out of his Social Security or whatever. And so they reduce, they say if he's getting in-kind support, if he's getting already supported from the trust to pay for rent, they're going to reduce your Social Security or the individual's Social Security up to 1/3 of the Social Security that they get. So let's say you get, I don't know, it's up to what, $735 is the maximum at that point. Take 1/3 of that, that's a couple $100 a month less that individual would get if you made a distribution for room and board. Now, you can certainly work around that by making sure the distributions for some other good things the individual needs, but it just can't be for the maintenance of the individual. And I just mentioned that because you get into some stickiness now when you're talking about trust, because it's like you have to kind of know, for that trustee, it may not be the parents who set up the trust, but the trustee you designate, that sibling, that neighbor, they're going to have some knowledge, or at least grow in knowledge, of what kind of works for Social Security and Medicaid. Okay, so there's a little bit of complexity. I don't want to oversell the special needs trust, but so they have to kind of be mindful of what happens when you make a distribution. I already mentioned that any assets in the first party trust can and probably will be used to pay back Medicaid for services rendered to the individual. Okay? Any questions on the first party? Yes.
Is there a timing, because like when the individual gets assets, like their paychecks and stuff,
Yes.
how soon would would those funds have to be put into a trust or a stable account to not count as assets?
That's a great question. That is a great question. So I would say within a month. I don't know. What you want to avoid is just having the asset count. So if you just have it sitting in a savings account of the individual, it's his paycheck.
Right.
Okay. You know, having it there a couple days doesn't. You know, you could make an argument like it's in flow somewhere. Okay, but if it's just sitting for months, that's not good. You know. So they're going to count the resource. So I would say month is a stretch, but you know, so you want to get rid of it within the month. Okay. Does that sound right to everybody? And yeah, feel free to always kick in because I'm not. Some of you probably have more knowledge than I in some of these issues. So yes, go ahead.
Wouldn't there be any reason in the current environment to set up a first-party special needs trust instead of a stable account? It seems like the stable account offers more benefits than the first-party trust.
Well, that is a great question, and let's hold on to that one because I kind of start making the comparisons towards the end of the presentation, and that will kind of help pull all things together. But there are some limited circumstances where the ABLE account isn't the best, and I don't want to jump the gun. I'm going to make you hold on to that. But good thought, good question. Yeah, trusts are a little bit not as flexible, so they do have to work by rules that enable them to maintain their unique feature of being able to shelter assets from the state. There's kind of like a bureaucratic cost to that, if you will. You can't manage around it, okay, but you just have to know the rules, okay. Okay, any other questions on the first party S&T? Okay. So this third-party trust, and I'll refer to it as a wholly discretionary third-party trust because there's you're going to have language set in that document that gives this trustee whole discretion about how trust assets are managed. Now that trustee can't just do exactly what he wants with the money, okay? I mean, he is a fiduciary, which is a legal term. I mean, he has to act on the best interest of the individual. But he still has a whole discretion in terms of how trust assets are managed. But in this situation, since the funds are coming from outside the individual, it's coming from the family or other people, then there's no payback provision. And importantly, upon the individual's death, then, the grantor can designate how that money goes to other beneficiaries, the remainder, what I call the remainder beneficiaries. So after the individual's needs are taken care of, and it's really after their death, okay, then you can designate how the trust assets get divvied up to other family members.
But only after their death.
Only after their death, right. If you want, to give money directly to other family members before the individual dies, you're going to have to think about setting up a whole different trust. Separate trust. That's not a special needs trust, it's a separate trust. Or you could just by will, just directly designate the money to those other family members, okay? I mean, they don't need it. You don't necessarily have to have a trust set up for that, but a lot of people think that's wise, especially if their kids are younger. So, so that's all I have to say on that since we've covered this kind of. Any questions on the wholly discretionary third-party trust. Yes?
What kind of safeguards can be put into place for being a fully discretionary? You know, in case whoever you designated as a trustee, I mean, you love and care about them, they're a member of your family, but,
They
you
could
know.
go awry.
Right.
And that's a big issue. It's like, you know, how do you know, what's going to happen, right? Well, if it's clear that the trust is, you know, not really being managed for the benefit of the beneficiary, of the individual, I mean, the individual can go to court or, you know, find someone to help him go to court and remove the trustee. It's a hassle, okay? That is done, yeah. And you could set up arrangements, and we'll talk about this a little bit, where you have co-trustees. This is something I am partial to because there's paperwork involved in managing the trust, keeping track of distributions, managing investments. So you could have all that paperwork set up by what I call a professional trustee, like a bank, okay? And so that provides a check and balance on that family member who may just be steering things in a way of like, hey, you know, I'm just gonna just keep the assets for the trust because I'm a remaining beneficiary of this. And it happens, unfortunately, yeah. So does that kind of answer your question? Yes?
Do trustees have to do annual reporting to some
Yes,
entity?
I'll get into some of those requirements, right. There is annual reporting. It's not, there is some complexity here, so I want to get into some of those duties of a trustee, etc. Yeah. So one of the points I want to make here is in setting up these trusts, in having them drafted, it's not like, you know, we probably all have some relative out there who's a lawyer that we can, you know, have draft a trust. And they might do an adequate job of that. But please don't do that because special needs trusts are a different animal. They're more complicated. It requires precise drafting in order for that trust to be considered a special needs trust. And to the point where it can, if there are certain clauses in there, certain terms, it can be nullified by, it's primarily the county, so it would be Claremont County Job and Family Services. They could nullify that trust and all of a sudden you're back from, you thought you had a valid third-party trust set up and now you're in a situation where the individual has all these assets. It's a hassle for everybody. You know, now they have to try to work with getting probably a first-party special needs trust set up. So what's the answer to that? Is find an estate planning attorney that has knowledge of Medicaid and Social Security, and I'd specifically ask that lawyer, you know, have they set up a special needs trust? Have they actually had one approved by the state? Now, it's not, the state doesn't approve them, but some lawyers actually will get letters from the county saying that it's been reviewed. They have some working relationship with county folks at Medicaid. So it's at that level because the county JFS will review, they have the right to review that trust document. So I just really make a big deal of that because if that language is disqualified, that could be a real hassle for everybody. So don't cut corners on this part of it because there is a cost, obviously, in finding this right estate planning attorney, but versus like an ordinary attorney, if you will. But you want to find the right attorney. Now, unfortunately, I don't have great connections in the Cincinnati area, but I'm sure in this area, you can find someone with that expertise. Okay, and I don't know if Claremont, if you guys make referrals to attorneys. I know you can't recommend, but
Yeah, I'm not
Okay.
sure.
We have a list that we can.
Okay.
you do have a
we can-
list. Okay.
But we can't recommend.
You can't recommend,
Right.
but you could go off the list. And I just wonder if on the list, if all those are special needs, estate plan, you just don't
And
know.
we can't guarantee
You
that.
can't
That's-
guarantee that, I got you, okay. So, but,
If
okay.
you look them up online, they usually say.
Sometimes, yeah, I mean, just ask the right questions. You get familiar with Medicaid? Have you drawn up a special needs trust? Not just a trust, but a special needs trust. So you're really trying to probe their exact knowledge, because this is like a specific sub-discipline within the legal profession. So you've done that?
I did it in Cleveland, we had, yes, our trust drawn up there, and we went to a person who always went out and spoke about doing these things, and
Right.
spoke about how to do it, and it was like $300, you know, it was quite a few years ago,
Yeah.
but they were like the top of the line, and it was worth it, because I knew they did it right, and so,
Well, that's good, yes, thank you. It's not, I don't think it's $300 anymore, but, yeah. But it's still worth getting it set up right. And, yeah, so part of that precise drafting is, saying that the trust isn't set up just for, it's not set up for the health support, education, maintenance, or welfare of the individual. I mean, ultimately, a trust is for the benefit of the individual, but it's not for kind of like the regular maintenance. You think of the trust is for like the extras. The extras could be a wide variety of things, like transportation, like things that Medicaid will not cover, like trips, like entertainment, but it just can't be for those room and board type of things. Okay. So this is my financial planning hat on here. So what's the advantage to you, the family member, in setting up this special needs trust? And for me, I think the main advantage is this: there's this peace of mind that you have that, okay, at least I don't know exactly when this person's going to get the waiver. I can't control that exactly. But at least I have a plan in place for how my financial assets are going to be used to help my loved one. Okay, so there's a peace of mind that occurs in having a plan in place, and you know that at least those assets are not going to disqualify that individual from getting Social Security and Medicaid. That's the best you can do. All right. So what are the disadvantages? So there's always a wrinkle here, right? So part of it is just, the complexity of setting up a trust. So we're going to get into what are the duties of a trustee, what's the paperwork required of that. There's a cost. There's a cost to setting it up. So I would say I'm familiar with, on the lower end, potentially, that $750, so closer to $1,000 range, up, and it could easily get up to $2,500 to $3,000. So I know that's a wide range. Part of it is because it depends on the experience of the attorney you're talking about, and part of it just depends on the complexity that you choose in setting up. You could set up a bunch of rules in your trust document and that kind of thing. So there's a little bit of variability, obviously, between lawyers, and there's some variability on you in terms of what you want put into that trust document. So that's a disadvantage. I think a big holdup for families is who to designate as a trustee. So it's like, I don't want to place this burden on this sibling at this point, because I don't know. I don't know if they're the right one. right? And I totally sympathize with that. So I don't have great answers. I could tell you things to look for in a trustee. I could tell you maybe work with a co-trustee arrangement to try to lessen the bar of the duties on that family member. But ultimately, that is a big decision, and I think that's a big impediment for people in setting up a trust. Now, can you go forward and set up a special need trust and ultimately, I don't think it's very cost effective to not have any trustee in mind when you set up a trust, okay? But you may just have like one person in mind. 10 years later, it could be someone else, because people do change over time. So don't necessarily, I think of this as a lot like wills. Some of our clients are like, hey, have you set up a will? Yeah, I set one up like 15 years ago. Oh, really? Well, things may have changed since 15 years ago in terms of what what your wishes are. It's always good. We like to have review our clients' wills like once every 5 years or so. Okay, and I think it's no different than with a trust. And it's not going to cost, that entire amount of money just to have a trust review. It could just be a cursory review by the lawyer, and that everything's okay, or you may want to change up the trustee at that point, okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
How difficult is it to change this trustee?
You just,
I mean,
I don't think it's
Just
very,
changing the document.
it's just, I don't think it's very difficult at all. I think it'd be, I don't know if it's like, and this is where I don't have the legal terms, I don't know if it's like an addendum to the trust, or if they just scratch that name out and put another one in, but no, I think it's like an hourly rate at that point, I don't think it's a big deal. Any other? Okay, so then there is also the cost of maintaining a special needs trust. Now, most trusts that I'm familiar with, or special needs trusts, they're not funded when the family members or the parents are alive. So there really isn't, if there's no funds to be managed, there really isn't, there's a cost to setting it up, but there isn't any ongoing maintenance cost for that. It's only when, family members have passed away, you have that trustee in place, now there's going to be some cost. There's cost just for managing the investments. I can't sell myself short that way. There is someone has to do that. It could be the bank does that as well, but there's also reporting requirements. How are the funds being distributed? You also file a tax return for a trust, because it's considered, if the family members have passed away and it's irrevocable at that point, meaning you can't make any changes to the trust. Now it's really hard to make a change to a trust. It's irrevocable, okay? So when a trust is irrevocable, and you can't make any changes at that point, it becomes like a separate entity. And just says that entity has to file a tax return. And so someone has to do that. Okay? So that's all part of this disadvantage in setting up of a special needs trust. Okay? Any?
I do have a question, like in that point of view, if it's irrevocable, the trust now,
Right.
would you set that up in your document, in your trust, who would be the next?
That's a great
person?
question, right. So that's
Yeah.
often the case. So, it's like, well, what happens if the trustee dies before the individual dies? So typically, you have language that allows for a successor trustee. So you can name the successor trustee, or you can give the power to the trustee to name a successor trustee. What you're trying to avoid is like punting on that, and then it just goes into a court situation. It's like,
Is that what would happen then if
Yes.
you didn't have anybody else?
yeah, they would figure it out at some point in time, And I'm not trying to diss what they do, it's just, it's out of your wishes hands. They're gonna try to figure out what your best, and the individual's best wishes are.
But you could give the trustee the discretion to do that.
Yes. Yeah, typically they have the discretion to pick the successor, well, I shouldn't say typically, you can name the successor trustee in the trust document as well. So, yeah. Okay. So we already kind of hammered on this, I don't know if I need to hammer on it again, but just picking the right attorney. I actually worked with a client. They thought they had a trust in place. Actually, I've worked with a couple. They thought they've had a trust in place, I'm covered. And then it's like, well, that was like 20 years ago. Let's just have this reviewed by the right attorney. Attorney looks at it and said, nope. Just had to throw it out, redraft it, okay? I mean, it wasn't the end of the world, but it could have been. And there was another cost, I guess, that there was another cost to doing that. But it's always good, you know, so let's say you just have a question mark, like I had a trust set up and you don't know if it was set up the right way. It's always good to have a review. Let's say it's all clean, that's a great use of $200 or $300 an hour, just to have that peace of mind, okay? And I know that's a real cost, but, okay, so choosing the right trustee, that's a lot of the impediment for families. And you want someone who understands the unique needs of the individual, who has an emotional tie to the individual. I think that's an important qualification. So it's not just understanding the rules, it's not just doing the mechanics of being a trustee. They, in their heart, you know, want the best benefit for the individual. So often that is a family member or it's a trusted friend, okay, that you've seen work with Johnny over the years, and they have their best interests at heart. So a couple other key things is they have the willingness to do it. I mean, it's not something, I know, I mean, I don't want to be too obvious, I mean, it's like, that's a duh, but, you know, you don't want to spring this in the trust document, like it's just like, you know, they're surprised, you know, when the family member dies, like this happens. So it's a conversation, you know, because this is going to involve some time on their end. Are you going to share that with the class?
Sorry about that.
No, I have my phone just like randomly talk to me too sometimes. Like, really? At the weirdest times. So you know, so they may have an emotional tie and everything, but do they have that willingness to serve, that capability? Because it is a time requirement. Even if they're not necessarily, you know, they're not taking hands-on care of the individual, but they're going to have to approve withdrawals from the trust, even if they're not doing the paperwork. Typically, yeah, bank wants to work with a co-trustee who's saying, yeah, go ahead, that withdrawal makes sense, okay? And they're going to have this understanding or willingness to learn some of the ins and outs of Social Security and Medicaid. Actually meet with Social Security and say, here's the assets we have in place, and here's what's in the trust, and here's what was withdrawn over this past year, and here's what those withdrawals, here's what they were for, okay? So being able to have some accurate record keeping. Now again, some of that record keeping can be done by the professional trustee, but at the end of the day, you know, who's kind of, you know, meeting with Social Security, who's meeting with Medicaid, it's going to be that family member trustee. Okay, so there is some time in doing that. So I say at the end, don't underestimate that time. And I'd say, I think it's okay to have the trust pay for those trustee services. So that might, I think it's just a recognition, it's just a recognition, like, there is a time element that we're considerate of. And that may help that person decide, like, yeah, I can do that if you're paying for it. Yeah. So it doesn't mean that they're not caring for the best interest of the individual. It just means there's a cost to their time that you're recognizing. Yes.
What might that look like in a trust?
So you can designate, like, broadly, like the trustee can be reimbursed for his time, or you could designate a payment rate. I don't know. I mean, you have a lot of authority as the grantor when you're setting up that trust. I have not, actually I haven't, in the situations I'm familiar with, it's been gratis, but, so I don't know exact language that you'd put in there. I guess if you're concerned about what the rate is, you could specify they shall get paid, $5,000 a year, or $1,000, I'm just making up numbers, okay. Or you could give them more authority, like they can make withdrawals to pay for their time. So it just depends on well, there is a test of reasonableness. They have to, I mean, you can't just do whatever you want as a trustee. So, but in fact, that's where you probably want guidance from your attorney in terms of, hey, what have they seen in doing this? Okay. I'm not an attorney, by the way. Yeah, you already know that. So, okay. So some of these duties, we've kind of gone around the edges of what those duties are. So this record keeping, just understanding how, what the distributions are being paid for. So Social Security's got to want to know, were you making distributions for room and board? And you're going to have to say, no, they were for, these trips, and they were for TVs and clothes and all these other things that weren't room and board. So if the trust is revocable, or excuse me, irrevocable, that means you have family members have deceased, can't make changes to the trust document anymore, then that trust has to do tax filings once a year, and so someone has to do that. We've already talked about knowledge of Medicaid and Social Security. Importantly, so I don't want to sell my service short here, just understanding how to invest those trust assets. So there's going to be a certain amount of money in that trust, and the goal is you don't want to be too conservative, because you want the trust assets to grow over time. So you don't want to just put it in like a savings account and get 0.1% interest. We know, I don't even look at my savings statements because it's like there's nothing there. I mean, it's what I put in there, plus 5 cents or something. Okay, so you want to have the trust assets grow, and the point being is you want them to last at least over the lifetime of the individual. So there's kind of like balancing out risk and reward. I mean, if you don't take any risk, your assets are just going to degrade because of inflation. So you don't want that to happen. So you want to invest in a certain percentage of stocks and bonds to kind of keep it less risky. So there's often times where these trusts are managed by an investment advisor, or it could be a professional trustee, like a bank. And so after considering all those kind of more the mechanics of watching over the trust, it's like, yeah, you may decide that having a professional trustee makes sense. And as I mentioned, a lot of times when you think of professional trustee, you think of banks. They're, they're everywhere in every town. There's going to be a bank that provides trust services. And I'm not, I think it'd be good if the bank had knowledge of working with a special needs trust because of these withdrawal rules that we talked about, where the bank, they should have knowledge of Medicaid and Social Security as well. So you want to see if the bank has that knowledge. But the point in having a professional trustee is that lessens the responsibility on that family member who would be then kind of like a co-trustee for the trust. So typical things that a corporate trustee does is they do the record keeping, and then they'll send out, like, here's the record of withdrawals. They'll send that out to the co-trustee, they'll send that to the beneficiary, they'll send it out to, maybe you designate Social Security as receiving paperwork on that. They can pay, you can have them set up to pay bills, so the trust, let's say there's regular withdrawals for cable television out of the trust, so the bank could set up an automatic bill pay to do that. They provide regular investment statements on how the trust is doing, and they can also do the tax filings. I mean, what I'm familiar with in the banks I've talked to is they usually, that's like a separate service that they contract for, so they'll be able to refer to an accountant that would do that filing. So when I talk about cost, and for a professional trustee, usually the cost of doing the tax filing is separate. Okay. And just managing the assets within the trust. That's all of what you look for in a professional trustee. Okay, any questions on that? I know that's kind of dry as toast without the butter. Okay, yeah.
If you have things set up to go into a family trust from your investments,
Right.
is there any reason you have to change the name, or they just set up, that person will have access to them? Right?
That person will have access, right. So we'll
You can
talk a
just
little
keep
bit.
it there. then-
Yeah, so the key, and I'll get to that in a second, the key is making sure that whatever asset you're talking about, whether it's your house or whether it's your IRA, whether you just have an individual savings, that you designate the trust, not the individual. Okay, so every trust has a name. The Jones Family Foundation, dated September 1st, 2017. It always has to have a date associated with it too. That's the title of the trust. And so you designate as a beneficiary now, it's not the name of the individual, it's all going to the trust. So, yes?
Are the concerns about Social Security specifically regarding SSI, people who are in SSI?
That's a great question, yeah. So what are we talking about? Why is Social Security concerned? So there's a distinction between SSI and SSDI, and maybe that's what you're directly getting to. SSDI, and hopefully you've all at least looked into, if you're receiving Social Security, most of the time it's more beneficial for your individual to be receiving SSDI than SSI, because they qualify for half your Social Security earnings. So, you could just do the math. It's half of what you're getting Social Security, or what you're gonna get Social Security. Is that gonna be greater than 735? And a lot of times it is. Okay, and so that's a quick primer on SSDI and SSI. I would say most of the time people are on SSI, so that's why I speak that way. But SSDI, once you're on that, you don't have to worry about assets in qualifying for that payment. So that's what's nice about it. So there's less rules and rigidity on So yeah, by all means, try to steer things into SSDI as soon as you can. Yeah.
Is that just a matter of going and?
Okay, so it's really upon,
Qualification? Yeah, I
it's
thought.
a-
there was
you
one.
have to be receiving, Social Security yourself. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So I believe when you applied for Social Security, there's a section, is do you have a child with a disability or do you have a disabled son or daughter? And you check that box and they make the connection.
When we went in to file, my daughter had already been receiving SSI, and then she earned enough on her own to get some SSDI
Oh,
on
she
her own
qualified for her
record.
own, okay.
So she was getting both of those.
Oh,
And then when my husband opened his record to file, they changed her over to, they called it disabled.
adult child
Adult
DAC.
child benefits.
Yeah, DAC, yeah, so sometimes it's referred to as DAC.
Right, so
Yeah.
she gets the equivalent of half of what he would draw. And so that's.
So it's a good digression, because this is important for
Yeah, it was.
people to know. It's usually set up automatically, but make sure Social Security knows
Right.
when you're getting the retirement benefit.
You can file and defer too.
What's that?
You can file and defer.
Okay. Well, this is for the individual though, so.
It's still, you can-
Oh, you're saying you could file to defer and then they would still qualify?
They could claim under yours.
They'll get it.
They'll still get
Even,
the
even though, if you're 66, you're qualified for Social Security, you file for it
and you
and
defer.
defer the payment until you
But-
actually need it. But in the meantime, your dependent can be receiving the benefit.
That's great to know. Okay, so that is good to know. In fact, I didn't know that myself, so I learned something new. So you can defer, because a lot of times you want to defer, because your payments increase all the way up to 70. So, but that doesn't penalize the individual. So can you do that at age 62 though?
I don't think so. I think you have to
That would
be
be
full
a-
retirement age.
Full retirement, okay, so I have to research that one, not that I disbelieve you, that sounds great.
No, I think you can file and suspend as early as 62.
And then that the individual, yeah, you can
But-
definitely do
But I
that.
think that affects permanently, like if the spouse then claims on your record, I think it limits the amount that
That's
he or
right.
she could get.
That's right, that's
It can
true. I think what
penalize.
happens
Changed
is,
that though recently.
Yeah, it was a recent
Well,
change.
yeah, they
Recent
just made
change.
some changes last year.
yeah, but I think well, so my opinion, I'll have to research out to make sure, but I think they're not gonna take 50% of that full retirement age if you
Right.
filed at 62. They'll take what the 62 amount would be, take 50% of that, that's my guess. So there is some math you have to do to figure out, when to pull the trigger on SSDI.
Well, if you wait till full retirement age, and you defer, then your benefit, when you like to receive it, continues to increase
Right.
For the length of deferment.
And you're saying, right, and you're getting 50% of that full, your
The dependents are.
your dependents are right now, okay. That's great, that's good to hear. So the only question mark we have is what about earlier? And so, do they, because the ultimate would be, hey, at age 62, you file and defer, or file and suspend, and have the individual start getting their 50% at age 62. So we'll find out to see if there's any penalty on that. Okay, good questions. So what does it cost to have some of these services done? And usually the services, yeah, you're gonna have to use a microscope there on your slides. Doesn't show up real well here. But I'll tell you, so for your brain, and then you can take your microscope later, is they base it upon assets in the trust. So let's say you had $100,000 in the trust. It's like a percentage of those assets. So it's usually, and they can break it down two ways. One is for kind of like the administration of the trust, and that's usually a point to a point and a half, or, excuse me, 0.25 to 1%, all the way up to 1%. So let's just say, for simplicity of math's sake, you got $100,000 in the trust. 1% of that per year would be the trust administration. So 1,000 to do trust administration, which includes sending out information to the trustee, to the individual. Here's the distributions that were made on the account. Here's the investment statements of the account. And then there's also, on top of that, there's between a 0.5 to 1.25% fee just to manage the investments. So just for simplicity, let's say that's another 1%. So you take, combined, that's 2% of assets every year for that professional trustee to do what they're doing. Now, that may very well be worth the cost, because all that hassle then is taken off the family member's shoulders and having to do that. So I do make a statement at the end. It's not always the case, but mainly the case, or let's say from my experience, is it becomes more cost effective to have a professional trustee the more assets that you're talking about. So maybe as a rough guideline, it just really uses a rough guideline. If you're thinking that you may have assets of more than $250,000, it may be worthwhile to think about having a professional trustee at that point. Okay, and remember, they're not going to charge anything until there's actually funds in the trust itself. So this would be something you'd name in your trust document, like, hey, this bank will be the co-trustee, okay? Or you could have the family member decide to use a co-trustee, but a professional trustee. Either way. But I guess I would say, as much as you can get set up for that family member as possible, even researching who might be the best professional trustee, the better off they're going to be. And the better off, you're going to have a better sense of, like, whatever plans I have for my loved one are still going to be in place even upon my death, because I've already kind of like put the trust document together, I've named my trustees. Hopefully even the trustees, they have connection with Johnny, they have connection to me, so they know my wishes. So everything, the goal is everything kind of continues in place. You're taking care, you're providing for your son or daughter before, now it's just the trust that's doing that. That's kind of like the ultimate, is just to have everything kind of stay the same over time. Okay. So now we really get to the fun part, talking about trust taxation. I say that facetiously, but I just want you to be aware that there's, once the trust is funded, there's these costs, not just to manage the trust, but also in terms of taxes. And so if it's a first party trust, this is actually advantageous for the individual. We talked about there being this limitation of, wow, all the funds are going to revert to the state at the end of a first party trust. That's kind of a bummer. But one advantage of a first party trust is in most cases, those first party trusts, they're going to be considered, it's going to be on the tax return of the individual, okay? And the individual isn't necessarily going to just have a lot of income, so taxation is going to be low on those types of trusts. So you don't have to worry about costs there. It's really when you're talking about third-party wholly discretionary trusts where you can get into some tax issues. And principally, what the goal of any trust is you want to make sure that it doesn't earn so much income that you can't get that income distributed back to the individual, because then it's going to be taxed at these really high rates. So we're used to being taxed probably too much, but you know, you're at the marginal rate of 15 or 25%. Taxation on trusts are like 40%, okay? So if it earned, it was a good year in income, it earned $10,000 in income, and you have to file a tax return on that. Now, you do get a couple exemptions, they're really small, like 1,000 or 2,000. But the rest of that's gonna be taxed at 40%. So 4,000 just goes out the window of that 10. So you kind of want to try to avoid that, and we'll talk about ways you avoid that. But the primary way is to distribute the income to the individual. Does that make sense? Are we all okay with that? Okay, so I kind of went into the next slide. So we kind of already talked about this as well, the beneficiary designations. So whatever asset you have, whether it's your house, whether it's your savings accounts or your investment accounts or your IRAs or your 401ks, all those things, you know, you put in who you want those assets to go to. And just don't put in the name of your loved one. Put in that name of the trust. Okay, because if you do put it in the name of the individual, they're going to be disqualified for a certain amount of period of time until the assets get designated to a trust somewhere down the road. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Kind of covered this point already too. The main benefit of an S&T, whether it's first or third party, is that it shelters assets from Medicaid, Social Security in terms of counting it as assets. We do have to be mindful with the S&T how withdrawals are made. They can't be made for room and board, otherwise our SSI payment gets reduced. So the way to handle that is just be mindful of what the withdrawals are made for. And one thing, actually, I just wrote an article on this that is fairly recent, is the federal government, Health and Human Services, sent a letter out to all the Medicaid directors and said, withdrawals from an S&T to an ABLE account is okay. So in other words, it's not going to count against Social Security. And so that's just like a huge thing, because now you've built in some flexibility into the S&T, where it had these inflexible rules about room and board. Well, it's like, okay, I'm just going to have the S&T pay the ABLE account, and then ABLE account pay for the room and board. Is that too quick?
Yes.
You know, we'll talk a little bit about ABLE accounts and S&Ts together, but I'm just assuming that you probably you can set up both. It's so cheap to set up an ABLE account. You can make a distribution from the S&T to the ABLE account. ABLE account makes a distribution to the rent to pay for the individual's rent, and that's considered okay. That's huge. I mean, that's a huge, what it does is it builds in flexibility, kind of like in the back door for an S&T. And it shows you the complementary nature between the ABLE account and the S&T together. They work together, yeah.
And that's a regulation, or is it a clarification of the rule?
It's a clarification, yeah. And I promote it, do a little advertising, sorry, but I have a newsletter, electronic newsletter. I just wrote an article, actually, just today came out, but I'm happy to make a reference on that. And I actually refer to the document. I mean, so it's not just my word, it's actually CMS. You could read the letter for yourself. Okay. So funding a trust. So this is, can be a problem, obviously. It's like, well, we've got to fund the trust with some assets. And we can maybe designate our assets upon our death. But you may want to think also about using life insurance as a funding vehicle. And not term insurance, but whole life insurance. So instead of counting on I like to think of the assets you're maintaining in your IRAs, 401ks, so forth. That's for your retirement. Okay. So if you want to take care of your loved one upon your death, maybe use the life insurance as a way to do that. Whatever the death benefit would be designated on that policy. And that's kind of maybe a more manageable way to save up for the amount you think your loved one's going to need upon your death. So that's a separate kind of decision you have to make, or maybe a discussion with a planner. Is just trying to figure out what amount of money should the trust contain upon your death. So you kind of have to figure, there's a lot of variables, I know. You don't know exactly what waiver they're going to receive, if they're going to receive a waiver, how much money they're going to get public assistance-wise. But you can't count on something from Social Security. You probably can count on something in terms of Medicaid. So you try to manage like, okay, so the trust is going to pay for those extras. And so I want to designate, I'm just working with a family that's like they thought maybe $12,000 a year. Okay, now that's in today's dollars. Their kid's probably going to not need to live off trust assets for another 40 years. So you all have to extrapolate that to what the dollars translate to 40 years from now and make sure that it comes up with $12,000 a year for the remaining lifetime of that individual. So there's some math to be done, but then once you figure out what that trust amount is, then you can think about maybe buying a life insurance policy for that amount. Or you're going to have to designate some of your assets that you're saving for your retirement and say, hey, I'm not going to spend all those, and that's going to go in the trust. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, good night. So I think we're just meant to go to 3 o'clock, and it's already 2:57. So how much grace, I mean, you guys have to, if you just have to go, just get up and walk. It's fine with me. But this is kind of like really important. So talking about stable accounts and special needs trust together. And so we've already mentioned they both shelter assets, so they're both similar in that regard. No problem in terms of qualifying for Medicaid or Social Security. They both are tax deferred vehicles. So money I put in a trust isn't going to start getting taxed, potentially not until upon withdrawal. But in an ABLE account, the cool thing there is not only does it grow tax deferred, but those withdrawals, as long as it's for the benefit of the individual, those withdrawals don't get taxed at all. So there's actually, an advantage, slight advantage of stable accounts to special needs trusts in terms of taxation. But, so the question over here is, well, why not just use an ABLE account? I mean, this is like a clear win over the trust. Well, there's limitations to the ABLE account because you can only fund, let's just say you can only fund $14,000 per year for that beneficiary. That is the limit. So if you're thinking upon your death, I mean, you have $200,000 that's going to get dumped in to a stable account. You can't do that. You have to put it into a trust at that point. You could put in $14,000 at a time from the trust, and we just mentioned, or I just mentioned, that's totally okay to do that. So you can have the trust, start making contributions of $14,000 a year to that stable account. But if you think about it, the other disadvantage of the stable account is that money all reverts back to the state or up to the amount that Medicaid services were provided. So it has a lien, Medicaid has a lien on any remaining assets in the stable account. So that's a huge limitation of that, yes.
Is that both the local funds and the federal funds? You said
Yeah,
back to the
it's
state.
total, it's total Medicaid, yeah, yes.
So it actually would go to the
No,
county,
local,
right?
not local
Yeah,
funds.
well, yeah,
No,
it's-
not local, yeah, I'm talking about Medicaid, so I was talking
Mhm.
about state, federal. Now, the county's contribution to Medicaid, so you're saying that that doesn't come in?
Well, I think what you're referencing is if we're funding a service that is paid for with local tax.
No, I mean, don't you pick up the
Oh, we
state's
have
portion of the Medicaid?
We have a portion of, yeah, we do
Yeah,
have.
and that would go
a match
back to the
component
county.
that.
If
So-
it was separate,
Yeah,
if
I
it
think
was,
there'd
Just
be-
come back to you.
Yeah, I think there'd be some probably cleanup there in terms of how that would look and, yeah.
Yeah.
So, but the bottom line is it does go back because it's paid for services, rental
Right.
services.
right.
Thank you.
So unless, and I think what you're trying to say is unless it was like a county-provided service that's not Medicaid, that wouldn't go to pay back the county. Yeah. So,
Well, the advantage is that it's tax.
oh yeah, well,
Free, is
so
that
the
the
tax-free,
advantage, or
for
is
once,
that-
okay,
I mean-
so let's explain the tax of the ABLE account. So you still pay tax on the money, like you earn an income and then you make $5,000 contribution to the ABLE account. You pay tax on that 5,000 somewhere, okay? But it's tax deferred in that 5,000 can grow and you're not paying any tax. Let's say it grows from 5,000 to 10,000. You don't pay any tax on the other 5,000 that's grown. And even upon withdrawal, you don't pay any tax, as long as it's for the benefit of the individual. So it's a clear win taxation-wise. Now, in the trust, it may be taxed if it's not, if you're not making those distributions on a timely basis, okay? So you may have tax issues with the trust, okay? So there's some limitations. So the other limitation on a stable account is after it reaches 100,000, it affects the individual's SSI payment. They suspend the SSI payment. So doesn't mean it goes away. It just means that account has to come back under 100,000, and then they can start getting SSI again. On death, again, the money in the stable account goes to the state. For a family S&T, it does not. First party S&T, it does. Okay, so so we have these three things bouncing around: first party, third party S&Ts, and then stable accounts. Any questions on that? Okay. I think I'm going to have to wrap it up at that. I still could talk a little bit about pool trust, but I'm going to say I have some brochures here about the pool trust. You work through an organization to do that, and they provide a lot of the expertise in terms of professional trustee services we talked about. So something that as an option to consider. So I also just wanted you to, if you have time, I'd like you to fill a survey out here. And on there, I have information. I have my card there. But I also, if you want to sign up for this newsletter I made reference to, it comes out monthly, although I'm not going to do one during Christmas. So if you want, you can sign up for that, or if you just want to talk about your individual's circumstances, I'm happy to do that as well. No charge whatsoever. just do me the favor, if you do want to get connected to that newsletter, I have a big problem of not reading people's handwriting. So be really, just if you could please just be real legible on how, in writing your name, that'd be helpful to me. So I think that's all I got.
I also have your slides that are a little bit larger. So I'll give those to everybody. You sent them to me in a PDF format, so I've copied them. I just don't know if I left them over there or over here. So I'm going to dig for those while you guys are filling that out.
Okay. And I have my contact information on the slides, but I also left my card on there. If you fill out the survey, the contact information's going to go away, so you can just pick up a card if you want to